A panoramic scene of the Great Plains at dusk, a small group of surviving Native Americans walking away from a smoldering village. The old chief leads them, shoulders slumped, carrying a broken spear. The vast prairie stretches to the horizon, lit by an orange sunset. A visual metaphor for the end of a way of life, cinematic, historical accuracy, detailed and somber mood. Let me tell you about this badass Lakota warrior named Sitting Bull. Picture this scene, he's out there singing war songs to a bunch of Crow warriors on horseback, basically trash-talking them after stealing their horses. Talk about adding insult to injury, right? The Crow chief isn't having any of this mockery. He steps up, and boom, we've got ourselves a deadly showdown. These two go at it hard, charging at each other like something out of a Western movie. The Crow chief drops to one knee, raises his rifle, and puts a bullet right through Sitting Bull's toe. Ouch! But this tough son of a gun doesn't stay down. He gathers himself up and shoots the chief dead, then walks over and finishes the job with his knife. With a bloody foot dangling from his horse, Sitting Bull rides back to familiar territory, those rolling hills, cool rivers, and silver moonlight where his people's teepees sit in circles. This victory would make him more than just a warrior. He'd become a medicine man, a spiritual leader who was better at reading the future than fighting battles. Now, here's the thing about the Great Plains back then, it was nothing like the East Coast, where native tribes had been getting wiped out by European diseases and forced onto reservations decades earlier. The plains were this crazy patchwork of different tribes with complex politics, alliances, and rivalries that'd make your head spin. These European horses had completely changed the game. Many tribes ditched farming altogether and went full nomad, following buffalo herds on horseback. The fur trade with white settlers turned into this mad scramble for wealth, guns, and more horses. But here's the kicker, all this hunting was thinning out the animal populations big time. The traditional warrior culture that used to be about small raids and taking enemy scalps, that escalated into devastating wars between tribes. The tribes with more horses and guns were scattering the weaker ones like leaves in the wind. And get this, the move beyond just surviving day-to-day was creating serious inequality within tribes. Women, who traditionally made buffalo robes, suddenly found themselves in this demanding commercial setup. Wealthy men were paying huge dowries to marry multiple wives who basically became laborers to make the men even richer. Still, these plains communities held on to their core values, bravery, generosity, and wisdom. Around the campfires, elders would share ancient stories and talk about the spirits living in the sky, rocks, and trees. Into this world comes the Great Westward Migration, thousands of creaky stagecoaches and covered wagons filled with white settlers heading to California to strike it rich in the gold fields. These folks were messing with buffalo migration routes, and their tendency to get into violent clashes with native peoples had the U.S. military stepping in to keep the peace. But here's the thing, chiefs like Sitting Bull had zero faith in the American government's ability to manage the plains fairly. And who could blame them? In 1864, American troops had turned a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho village at Sand Creek into a bloodbath. We're talking about soldiers who ignored white flags of surrender and gunned down mothers, scalped children, and took brains and fetuses as sick trophies. Absolutely horrific stuff. Neither Sitting Bull nor his isolationist Lakota followers believed treaties were worth the paper they were written on. Other Lakota chiefs had signed a deal allowing an American trail through their territory in exchange for $50,000 worth of supplies per year for 50 years. What happened? The U.S. government just decided to cut it down to 10 years after the fact. These treaties always screwed over the tribes when it came to land rights. Even Black Hawk, a Lakota chief, admitted it, these lands once belonged to the Kiowas and the Crows, but we whipped those nations out of them. We did what white men do when they want Indian lands. The displacement of tribes was playing right into the American government's hands. Landless, starving peoples like the Pawnee were more likely to accept moving to reservations just to survive. The Crow agreed to let American trails pass through their territory, but here's the catch: that land traditionally belonged to the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota. Civil War veterans and European immigrants started pouring through the landscape, and a Lakota chief named Red Cloud had had enough. He rallied his people with these powerful words: "Their presence here is an insult to the spirits of our ancestors. Are we going to give up their sacred graves to be plowed for corn? I am for war." Red Cloud's war brought tribes together to raid U.S. forts and wagon trains. This young Lakota warrior named Crazy Horse, equal parts mysterious and passionate, would lure American soldiers out of their forts into tall grass where hundreds of allied Indians were waiting. They found 81 American soldiers naked and mutilated. Red Cloud actually won that war. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty gave the Lakota a huge chunk of reservation land plus unceded territories for hunting that were supposed to be free from white settlement. Later that same year, this daring and unpredictable lieutenant colonel named George Armstrong Custer took his 7th Cavalry on a moonlit mission. They surrounded a Cheyenne village whose people had refused to move to Indian Territory in Oklahoma and had been hitting back at settlers. Custer, who'd made his reputation fighting Confederates, led his men at dawn to storm the village. They killed men, women, and children, set the teepees on fire, and slaughtered almost 1,000 horses. Faced with starvation and massacre, Red Cloud and his Lakota followers decided to try survival on the reservation. But Red Cloud smelled a rat. During a diplomatic trip to Washington, D.C., he discovered a hidden clause in that 1868 treaty: the unceded territory would only stay Indian land, as long as there were enough buffalo on the territory to justify the hunt. Meanwhile, thousands of Lakota chose Sitting Bull as their supreme war chief. This guy refused to acknowledge any treaties or settle on any reservation. In the summer of 1873, scouts brought news to Sitting Bull's camp that would change everything. Hundreds of wagons and horses had invaded Dakota and Montana territory. These were railroad surveyors, protected by 1,500 U.S. cavalry led by Colonel David Stanley with George Custer as his second-in-command. Sitting Bull mobilized Crazy Horse and other warriors to raid Custer's expedition day and night. The Americans fought them off, but then the raiders would just disappear into thin air. But here's the twist: no wave of railroad workers ever showed up. Why? The global economy had crashed. The New York Stock Exchange closed, industrial giants were drowning in debt, and poor workers were rioting in the streets. Meanwhile, the Lakota were reaching new heights of power. They were loaded with horses and buffalo robes, heavily armed, and striking in all directions, east, north, and west, stealing horses and raiding surrounding tribes, frontier settlers, and unlucky white hunters. The Lakota and their allies had become the most formidable bloc of native power standing in the way of U.S. expansion. That same summer of 1873, Lakota chiefs Pawnee Killer and Little Wound ran into Pawnee on disputed hunting grounds. Their warriors massacred nearly 200 Pawnee, most of them women and children left charred, scalped, and scattered in the dirt. The decline of buffalo herds was driving this tribal violence and quickly undermining Lakota power. White folks, fleeing the failing U.S. economy, were trespassing on native land to hunt buffalo. Some U.S. officials saw this as a golden opportunity to wipe out the Plains Indians' food and clothing source while clearing land for railroads. Army officers were actually providing ammunition and protection to hunters who killed millions of buffalo. We're talking 3,000 per day between 1872 and 1874. Can you imagine that slaughter? Starving Indians had to rely on U.S. government rations, only to discover that the corrupt Grant administration was giving them the absolute worst stuff available, cheap flour and rotten pork. Red Cloud traveled to D.C. to complain, and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs basically told him, "Too bad, we're seizing the unceded lands because they don't support enough buffalo anymore." Meanwhile, Custer had secretly explored the Black Hills and found traces of gold. When the Lakota refused to sell these sacred lands, President Grant ordered his troops to stand down and let whites enter the Black Hills freely. In December 1875, just months after the once fearsome Comanche tribe in the South was forced onto a reservation, Grant issued a deadline that would seal the fate of the Plains tribes. By January 31, 1876, every member of the Lakota Sioux people had to be on the reservation. Anyone who wasn't would be considered hostiles and hunted down like buffalo. Across damp hills streaked with snow, Sitting Bull's delegates rode out seeking alliances with Arikara, Mandan, and Hidatsa tribes. They traveled north to trade for guns. As white invasion loomed, old tribal rivalries started to thaw. Sitting Bull and his people migrated defiantly west toward the buffalo herds, and Indians from all over joined their cause, Lakota from reservations, Dakota refugees from Canada, Cheyenne exiles. Together, their rows of teepees stretched for miles across the plains in a 10,000-person multi-ethnic coalition. At an intertribal sun dance ceremony, Sitting Bull danced in a trance for hours and announced a vision to them, enemy soldiers filling the sky like grasshoppers, falling to their deaths. Days later, scouts spotted a massive American army miles away. In the dead of night, horses were readied, and Crazy Horse rallied 750 warriors to attack. In a swirling 6-hour battle, they inflicted enough damage to halt the U.S. advance toward the village. But a week later, more Sioux scouts were weaving through the camps now situated along the Bighorn River with bad news: American troops were close. Women packed their belongings with screaming babies in their arms. Sitting Bull pushed for negotiation, but soldiers started firing into teepees and shot his horse. It was clear they intended to destroy the village. Sitting Bull sent forth a massive force of Cheyenne and Lakota warriors who chased the Americans into retreat. But then, charging across ravines and gulches, George Custer arrived with another detachment. The massive Indian encampment was twice as large as he'd expected. Masterful horse warriors swarmed his positions and scattered the retreating Americans. On the far side of the river, Custer and about 50 men gathered on a hill. He pulled them into desperate formation, and through the tumbling clouds of gun smoke, their doom advanced, a ceaseless gallop of hostiles in the hundreds, with Crazy Horse leading the charge. Cheyenne and Lakota shot arrows and bullets into Custer's group, then poured onto them with tomahawks and knives. Blue-clad soldiers crawled through the grass with feathered arrows sticking out of their backs. One young Lakota later recalled, "There was a soldier on the ground still kicking. A Lakota rode up and told me, 'Boy, get off and scalp him.' I got off and started to do it. He had short hair and my knife wasn't very sharp. He was grinding his teeth, so I shot him in the forehead and got his scalp. They left no one alive." Custer was found stripped and torn into a ghastly figure. As one Lakota remembered it, "They came to fight us and we had to fight. These white men wanted it, they called for it, and I let them have it." After the Cheyenne and Lakota cleared the battlefields, they fled with their people. But from the halls of Congress came swift vengeance. American representatives passed a law forcing the Lakota to give up lands outside the Great Sioux Reservation and sell the Black Hills. Remember, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty said no future land deals could be made without signatures from 75% of all adult male Lakota. Congress overwhelmingly passed the agreement with just 10% approval. 7 million acres of land were seized. The remaining native inhabitants became outlaws in their ancestral lands. They wandered over hills to find heaps of buffalo flesh crawling with maggots. Black smoke stained the skyline of the Black Hills as men dug up the dark earth searching for gold. Crazy Horse finally reported to a reservation. When he was arrested a few months later, a struggle broke out and a soldier killed him with a bayonet. Sitting Bull, meanwhile, had vanished. He and his followers had settled in Canada, where they found plenty of buffalo for hunting and a place to pitch their fire-lit teepees and tell their children the ancient legends of their people. The last holdouts of native power in North America were crashing down. Chief Joseph and 700 of his sick and exhausted Nez Perce people from the northwest tried to escape north to join Sitting Bull, but the U.S. Army pursued and forced their surrender. After a few years, Canada's buffalo started disappearing too. In 1881, Sitting Bull traveled south with his people. The old chief still limped from that duel so long ago, and he surrendered to the U.S. with these words, "I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle." He and his followers were shoved onto a steamboat and imprisoned for 2 years at a military fort before being released to the Standing Rock Reservation. In the coming years, starvation, massacres, and broken treaties led to nearly all American Indians being forced onto reservations. On the Great Plains, proud warriors were made to push plows and farm terrible soil. The U.S. government kept cutting their rations to save money, and malnourished native children were devastated by disease. Hope came from the southwest in 1889. A Paiute named Wovoka prophesied that the spirits of fallen ancestors would return to drive out white settlers. Jesus would return, and from this spiritual drama would emerge a new land full of buffalo and free from war. All this, Wovoka claimed, could happen through regular performance of the ghost dance ritual. So the suffering tribes across the western U.S. began dancing for their deliverance, for divine apocalypse. Paranoid American officials feared Sitting Bull supported the ghost dance movement and ordered his arrest. For centuries, Plains Indians had kept oral histories with records called winter counts. An entry for 1890 shows the scene plainly, dozens of reservation police surrounding Sitting Bull's cabin. When one of the chief's supporters attacked Indian agent Bullhead, Bullhead spun and fired into Sitting Bull's chest. Another officer shot Sitting Bull in the head. The chief's 14-year-old son Crowfoot tried to hide but was pulled from under a bed and shot to death. Many of Sitting Bull's followers left to join another Lakota chief named Spotted Elk. U.S. troops from Custer's old 7th Cavalry forced his group to Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. They moved into the village to confiscate guns, and a struggle with one villager prompted the troops to start shelling the camp with cannons. They quickly killed all the Lakota warriors, then turned to shoot the fleeing women, children, and elderly. A baby was left nursing from its mother's corpse. After most had been killed, one survivor recalled, "A cry was made that all those not killed or wounded should come forth and they would be safe." Little boys came out of their hiding places, and as soon as they came in sight, soldiers surrounded them and butchered them there. A great winter storm fell upon the land, locking the twisted corpses in final frost. Brown blood clung frozen to tiny fingers. The dead chief Spotted Elk stared grotesquely upright. Men arrived to pile the corpses into mass graves, nearly 300 dead. The Great Plains sound different now than they used to. The churning scream of iron has replaced the thunder of 60 million buffalo. By the late 19th century, fewer than 1,000 buffalo remain total. The people of the plains aren't extinct, they've painstakingly preserved their cultures and languages. But in 1909, an old warrior on a reservation named Red Cloud, his face showing 9 decades of war and grief, summed up the new reality. "I who used to own rich soil in a well-watered country so big I couldn't ride through it in a week on my fastest pony, am put down here. I who used to control 5,000 warriors must tell Washington when I'm hungry. I must beg for that which I own."